Hey, I'm Shane, and today I'm going to be talking about the 28mm f2. This is a compact prime lens that's a great value for the Sony full-frame E-mount cameras. And I'm going to talk about what I like about it, but why ultimately I don't really use it very often anymore. So, this is a Sony 28mm f2. It's a very compact prime lens, and maybe the smallest prime lens Sony makes for their full-frame cameras. It's very lightweight and it fits great as being part of my travel kit, but I rarely use it for professional work, and I'll explain why later in the video. The big thing to start off with though is the 28mm focal length. It's a very unique focal length and it's not really ultra wide, and some people are more used to using 24 or wider. Or on the other end, using 35mm, and it kind of fits right in between there. It's great for kind of everyday documentary work, but not necessarily great at isolating any subject. In this video, I'm going to do a comprehensive review of the lens though, talking about what I like using it for, its strength, what I don't love about it, and ultimately how it compares to the other options on the market, and if it's a value for you to buy. I'll start off with the build quality of this lens. And honestly, that's probably my selling point on this lens and why I bought it. It's so small and comes in at only 200 grams, and it has an all metal body. It's not weather sealed and doesn't have a weather sealing gasket at the back, but it's still very durable. I've taken it out in the snow, in the rain, and just because of how cheap it is, I kind of haven't really cared too much for the lens. And it honestly is a tank. I often find myself throwing it in my pocket when I'm going out of the house while using the 55 or the 85mm, just because it's pretty much just in case I need a wider angle, and I often have found myself being appreciative that I had this lens with. This lens is exceptionally sharp for its price point, and at f2 it's very sharp in the center with minimal edge dullness in the corners. However, if you bring it down to f4 or f5.6, this lens is incredibly sharp and can be used for landscape work or whatever you need it for, really. My biggest gripe with this lens though is the distortion in vignetting. Normally when I'm making a review, this is when I say, oh, you can just fix it in post. However, this is pretty much the one lens I have experience with that I just get frustrated. A lot of the time while I was editing photos with this lens, I find that it's almost changing the corners a whole stop of brightness difference. This really limits how you're editing your photos, because overall you can't really raise your shadows as much or your exposure as much, because the edges will start having visible noise sooner than the center of the image. This also makes this lens not really useful for astro, because a lot of the time you like using some correction, or the camera will bake in the correction, and in those cases your images will be very hard to work with. I highly recommend looking at another option that's cheaper and a little wider angle, because you'll have a lot more success using a lens like that for taking images of the stars. This lens has a minimum focusing distance of 28 centimeters, which is actually very good. And if you want to get some very fun shallow depth of field shots, this lens can allow that, and with an f2, you can have a lot of bokeh in the scene. It's not necessarily the lens I'd recommend using for that, because at 28mm your background will look a little goofy with the wide angle. However, if that's what you're into, you definitely can do it with this lens. The bokeh balls are pleasant, not necessarily the greatest things you've ever seen, but with the 9 aperture blades, it actually renders quite nicely. The autofocus of this lens is actually quite stellar. I used it for a whole day one time on a gimbal at a comic convention, just making a cosplay video, and it actually turned out very well. The autofocus pretty much nailed it 99% of the time, which I was pleasantly surprised by. If you're into vlogging, this lens is also very useful for such an application, because at f2 you can get a nice blurry background and have yourself in focus. But the biggest thing is, unless you have terribly long arms like myself, you won't be able to really get that lens pointed at your face too well. As far as manually focusing goes, this lens is the same as most other Sony lenses, where it's a completely electronic system and it focuses by wire. The manual focus experience is pretty much the same as anything else you'd use. It's not great, but it's functional. I've been a little hard on this lens so far in the review, and I honestly think it's a little uncalled for, because this lens is a great value. It's only 450 US dollars or 600 Canadian, which is pretty insane because this lens is incredibly high performing for that price point. And if you pair it with another few primes, like I have the 85mm, 55mm, and the 28mm, and those three were what I carried with me for several months as the only things I'd take with me to shoots. And they completely had my focal range covered for what I like to do. So if you need a lens that complements that kind of setup, you cannot go wrong with the 28mm. The only thing to keep in mind is the issues I had with the vignetting and not necessarily the best focus in the kind of awkward focal length of 28mm. So I like to compare lenses usually to the other options on the market. In just this year, the Tamron 28-75 f2.8 came out for the Sony E-mount cameras. And this lens I think is honestly a better option if you're looking for a versatile lens to start off with, because it's a great value at 850 US dollars, noted $400 more than the 28mm. However, you're getting 28-75 at f2.8 with insane sharpness throughout the frame, and it's honestly better than the 28mm. So if you're starting out, I honestly recommend getting the 28-75 because that lens is just an absolute insane value. However, with that said, if you're a huge fan of the 28mm focal length, I'd recommend looking at maybe the Zeiss Batis 25mm f2. It's not at all in the same price bracket, but it's an exceptional lens, and the people who do own it absolutely love it. So I think that might be a better option if you're looking for that specific focal length. And if you really are looking for just a prime lens like this, that's super fast, there's now the 24mm G Master Sony lens at f1.4. So that's a better lens for astro, and also is at that 24mm focal length, which is in the same category kind of as 28mm. I should also mention there's a 16mm adapter you can attach to the end of this lens that makes it a fisheye lens, or a 21mm one that makes it an ultra-wide lens. The reason I didn't focus on these or own them is because they're an insanely poor value, and they degrade the image quality, they weigh more than the lens itself, and they basically just attach onto the end of the lens, which I don't really like. So I can't really recommend this lens if that's your intention with it, because you'd be better off just looking at a wider angle lens than this one, because there's Rokinons that are honestly a better option than this. So in conclusion, this lens is a great value, it's built very well, has adequate sharpness, but unfortunately, I don't really use it anymore. I had a very difficult time utilizing the 28mm focal length, and that's more a personal preference, but I just prefer my 35mm instead. In pretty much any situation where I've been taking this lens out, I always think, I think I'd rather the 35mm today, and just went with that. However, if you're looking for a cheap prime lens, this lens is a great option. And if it's something that you want to play around with, I don't think you can go wrong with it. Thanks for watching this video though. I really appreciate your time, and I would love your input. If you want to leave a comment below on something you thought about this video, or if you had any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Please consider subscribing or maybe liking the video if you enjoyed it and want to see more content from me. But anyways, I hope you have an awesome day, and thanks for watching again.